May 28, 1946. 6 a.m. Landsberg Prison, Germany. A wooden gallows stands in the prison courtyard. 28 men will be hanged here over the next 2 days. All of them are SS guards. All of them were convicted at the Dachau Trials. And one of them, a man named Johann Viktor Kirsch, will walk to the gallows knowing exactly what he did. He beat prisoners with an iron rod. He separated children from their parents in the Kinderaktion at Kaufering Subcamp. He watched as those children were loaded onto trains bound for Auschwitz, to the gas chambers. And now, 14 months after American forces liberated Dachau, Kirsch will hang. This is not Nuremberg. There are no international judges, no global press coverage. This is American military justice. Swift, brutal, and final. And this is the story of Johann Viktor Kirsch, the Auschwitz guard who beat children to death, and what he said in his final moments. Before we break down who Johann Viktor Kirsch was, what he did at Auschwitz and Dachau, how the Dachau trials worked, and what happened in his final moments on the gallows, subscribe right now. This video is educational. It explains the Dachau war crimes trials, the evidence against the guards, and the execution procedure used by the U.S. Army in 1946. Hit like. Drop a comment. Were the Dachau trials justice or revenge? Let's start with who Kirsch was. Johann Viktor Kirsch was born on January 3, 1891 in Saarland, Germany. He worked as a stonemason before the war, a skilled tradesman, an ordinary man. In 1933, the year Hitler came to power, Kirsch joined the Nazi Party. He was 42 years old. He fought in the Wehrmacht during the early years of World War II. And in 1944, at age 53, he joined the Waffen-SS. He was assigned to the concentration camp system, first to Auschwitz, then in the summer of 1944 to Dachau and its network of subcamps. His role, construction supervisor. He oversaw forced labor projects, building underground factories, armament facilities, projects powered by slave labor. And according to witness testimony at his trial, he was brutal. He beat prisoners with an iron rod. He kicked them. He struck them in the head. And some of those prisoners died from their injuries. Kirsch served at Auschwitz before his transfer to Dachau. The exact dates are unclear. The records are incomplete. But what is known is this. Auschwitz was the largest and deadliest Nazi concentration and extermination camp. Between 1940 and 1945, over 1.1 million people were murdered there, most of them Jews, gassed in chambers disguised as shower rooms, their bodies burned in crematoria. Kirsch was there. He was part of the machinery, not a commandant, not a doctor conducting experiments, but a guard, an enforcer, a man who kept the system running. And when he was transferred to Dachau in 1944, he brought that brutality with him. Dachau concentration camp was established in March 1933, just weeks after Hitler became chancellor. It was the first Nazi concentration camp. And by 1944, it had grown into a vast network, the main camp, and over 100 subcamps scattered across southern Germany. One of those subcamps was Kaufering, actually, a complex of 11 camps near the town of Landsberg am Lech. The Kaufering camps housed Jewish prisoners, most of them Hungarian Jews who had survived Auschwitz. They were brought to Kaufering to build underground armament factories for the Nazi war effort. The conditions were horrific: starvation, disease, brutal forced labor, and guards like Johann Viktor Kirsch. In late 1944, an order came down. The SS would conduct a Kinderaktion, a children's action, at the Kaufering camps. The goal: to separate children from their parents. Children under a certain age were considered unable to work. And in Nazi logic, those who could not work had no value. The children would be sent back to Auschwitz to be killed. Johann Viktor Kirsch participated in this action. He helped identify the children. He helped separate them from their parents. Witnesses at his trial described the scene: parents screaming, children crying, Kirsch and other guards using force, beating those who resisted. And then the children were loaded onto trains, sent east. and most of them never returned. This was one of the specific charges against Kirsch at trial: the separation of children and parents, knowing they would be murdered. Hold on. Before we go inside the trial, I need you to subscribe if you haven't already. Because what happens next, the liberation of Dachau, the arrests, the Dachau Trials, and the evidence against Kirsch, is the part that shows you how American military justice worked in 1946. Drop a comment. Should the guards have received fair trials? Keep watching. On April 29, 1945, American forces from the 45th Infantry Division and the 42nd Infantry Division reached Dachau concentration camp. What they found shocked them. Thousands of corpses, piled in rail cars, scattered across the camp. Bodies of prisoners who had starved to death, who had died of typhus, who had been worked to death. The survivors, skeletal, barely alive, greeted the Americans as liberators. But the Americans also found something else. The guards. Some had fled, but many remained, hiding in the barracks, trying to blend in with the prisoners, hoping to escape. Johann Viktor Kirsch was arrested on April 29, 1945. He was identified by prisoners. He was detained by American military police, and he was sent to an internment camp to await trial. The Dachau Trials were not like Nuremberg. Nuremberg, which began in November 1945, prosecuted the major Nazi leaders: Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, Albert Speer, the architects of the regime. The Dachau Trials prosecuted the functionaries, the guards, the doctors, the camp administrators, the men who carried out the orders. The Dachau Trials were conducted exclusively by the United States Army. Between 1945 and 1948, over 1,600 people were tried at Dachau. The trials were held on the grounds of the former concentration camp itself. A deliberate choice. The backdrop of Dachau, the barracks, the crematoria, the gas chamber, served as a constant reminder of the crimes being prosecuted. The first trial, known as the Dachau Main Trial or the Parent Case, began on November 15, 1945. 40 defendants, all accused of war crimes. Johann Viktor Kirsch was one of them. The official charge against Johann Viktor Kirsch and his co-defendants: violation of the laws and usages of war. The charge was based on the 1907 Hague Convention. The convention established rules for the treatment of prisoners of war and civilians during armed conflict. The charge was straightforward. The defendants, as members of the Dachau camp staff, had participated in the systematic murder, torture, starvation, and abuse of prisoners. The prosecution presented evidence: witness testimony from survivors, documents, photographs, and the defendants' own admissions. The trial lasted from November 15th to December 13th, 1945. 28 days. 70 witnesses for the prosecution, 50 for the defense. And on December 13th, 1945, the verdicts were delivered. All 40 defendants were found guilty. 36 were sentenced to death by hanging. 1 was sentenced to life in prison. 3 were sentenced to 10 years hard labor. Johann Viktor Kirsch was sentenced to death. The court specifically cited 2 actions in his sentencing. First, severe mistreatment resulting in death, including beating prisoners with an iron rod. Second, participation in the Kinderaktion at Kaufering, the separation of children from their parents knowing they would be murdered. Kirsch showed no remorse. He offered no defense beyond saying he was following orders. The tribunal rejected this. The principle established at Nuremberg, that following orders is not a defense for war crimes, applied equally at Dachau. Kirsch was guilty, and he would hang. Real quick, if you're still watching, you need to subscribe. Because what happens next, the months Kirsch spent on death row, the execution procedure, and his final words, is the part that shows you what justice looked like in 1946. Comment below. Do you think Kirsch deserved to die? Now, back to Landsberg Prison. After sentencing, the condemned men were transferred to Landsberg Prison, the same prison where Adolf Hitler had been held after the failed beer hall putsch in 1923. The same prison where Hitler wrote Mein Kampf. Now, it was War Crimes Prison Number 1, a facility for convicted Nazi war criminals awaiting execution. The condemned men were held in separate cells. They were allowed visits from chaplains. They were given limited contact with family. And they waited for the review process, for clemency petitions, for the final decision on whether their sentences would be carried out. Of the 36 men sentenced to death in the Dachau main trial, 8 had their sentences commuted to life imprisonment or long-term prison sentences after review. 28 would be executed. Johann Viktor Kirsch was one of them. In May 1946, the U.S. Army set the execution date, May 28 and 29, 1946. 28 men would be hanged over 2 days, 14 on the 28th, 14 on the 29th. The executions would take place at Landsberg Prison, in the prison courtyard. A wooden gallows had been constructed, simple, functional, built for one purpose. The hangman, Master Sergeant John C. Woods, the same executioner who had botched the Nuremberg hangings 5 months earlier in October 1946. Wait, that timeline is wrong. Let me correct that. The Nuremberg executions occurred on October 16, 1946, 5 months after the Dachau executions. John C. Woods executed the Dachau condemned men first in May 1946. Then he executed the Nuremberg defendants in October 1946. Woods had a reputation. He was efficient. He was willing. And according to witnesses, he was not always competent. On the night of May 27, 1946, Johann Viktor Kirsch was told, "Tomorrow you will be executed." He was 55 years old. He had been in custody for over a year. He knew this day was coming. He was allowed a final visit from a Catholic chaplain. Germany was a predominantly Christian country. Most of the condemned men were Catholic or Protestant. The chaplain offered last rites. He heard confession. He prayed with Kirsch. And then Kirsch was left alone, in his cell, to wait for dawn. At approximately 6 a.m. on May 28, 1946, guards entered Kirsch's cell. His hands were cuffed behind his back. He was led from his cell, down a corridor, through a door, into the prison courtyard. The gallows stood in the center, a wooden platform, 13 steps leading up to the trapdoor, a noose hanging from the beam. Other condemned men had already been executed that morning. Kirsch was not the first, and he would not be the last. He climbed the 13 steps. His legs were steady. He did not resist. And at the top, the hangman, John C. Woods, placed a black hood over his head. In those final moments, after the hood was placed over his head, but before the noose was tightened, the condemned men were sometimes given a chance to speak. Not always, but sometimes. According to records from the Dachau executions, most of the men said nothing. Some prayed. Some shouted defiance. And Johann Viktor Kirsch? The records do not specify his exact words. But multiple sources indicate that he, like many of the condemned SS guards, remained silent. No apology, no remorse, no final statement, just silence. And then the noose was placed around his neck. I want to stop here and address something directly. Johann Viktor Kirsch beat prisoners with an iron rod. He separated children from their parents, knowing they would be murdered. He was part of the machinery of genocide. And when given the chance to speak in his final moments, he said nothing. No apology. No acknowledgement of what he had done. Just silence. And I want you to ask yourself, what does that silence mean? Does it mean he felt no remorse? That he believed, even at the end, that he had done nothing wrong? Or does it mean he knew that no words could undo what he had done? That there was nothing left to say? I do not know. But I know this. The absence of remorse does not make the punishment less just. It makes it more necessary. Because if a man can participate in the murder of children and feel nothing, then he has forfeited his claim to mercy. Not because we are cruel, but because justice demands accountability. And sometimes accountability means death. John C. Woods stepped back. The warden gave the signal. Woods pulled the lever. The trapdoor opened. Johann Viktor Kirsch dropped. The rope snapped taut. His body jerked. And then, according to the execution records, he was pronounced dead within minutes. The Dachau executions were carried out in private. No press. No public witnesses. Just the required military officials, a medical officer, and the executioner. The bodies were removed from the gallows, placed in plain wooden coffins, and taken away. After the executions, the bodies of the 28 condemned men were cremated. The ashes were scattered. No graves. No markers. No memorials. The goal, as with the Nuremberg executions, was to prevent burial sites from becoming pilgrimage sites for neo-Nazis. The location where the ashes were scattered has never been publicly disclosed. Johann Viktor Kirsch, the man who beat prisoners, who separated children from their parents, who served at Auschwitz and Dachau, ended as ashes, scattered somewhere in southern Germany, unmarked, unremembered. Johann Viktor Kirsch was one of 28 men executed at Landsberg on May 28 and 29, 1946. The others included Martin Gottfried Weiss, the commandant of Dachau from 1942 to 1943. He was executed on May 29, 1946. His last words, "I am dying for Germany." Dr. Klaus Karl Schilling, an SS physician who conducted malaria experiments on prisoners. He was 74 years old at the time of his execution. He showed no remorse. Otto Forschner, commandant of the Kaufering subcamp where Kirsch served. Guilty of murder and mistreatment. All of them SS. All of them convicted. All of them executed. And all of them forgotten, except by historians. The Dachau Trials have been criticized. Some historians argue they were victors' justice, the winners prosecuting the losers. That the trials were rushed. That the defendants did not receive adequate legal representation. That the burden of proof was placed on the defense rather than the prosecution. These criticisms are not without merit. The Dachau trials were conducted quickly. The first trial lasted 28 days. 40 defendants. Hundreds of charges. That is less than 1 day per defendant. The defendants were represented by German lawyers appointed by the U.S. Army. Many of those lawyers had limited resources, limited time to prepare, and the tribunal, composed of U.S. military officers, had no requirement for legal training in international law. But here is the counter-argument. The evidence was overwhelming. Thousands of survivors testified. Documents proved the camp administration's complicity. Photographs showed the conditions, and the defendants themselves admitted to their actions. The question was never, did these men commit war crimes? The question was, how do we hold them accountable? Of the men sentenced to death at Dachau, 28 were executed. But of the men sentenced to life imprisonment or long prison terms, most were released early. By the mid-1950s, less than 10 years after the trials, nearly all of the Dachau convicts had been released. Some on the basis of good conduct, some on health grounds, some through clemency petitions. This was driven by Cold War politics. By the 1950s, West Germany was a key ally against the Soviet Union. The U.S. wanted a strong, stable West German government. And that government, under pressure from its own population, pushed for the release of convicted war criminals. The result, men who had been convicted of murder, torture, and abuse walked free. Some returned to civilian life. Some lived quietly, and some lived long lives. This is one of the most controversial aspects of the Dachau trials. Justice was delivered, but it was not sustained. Despite their flaws, the Dachau trials established important legal principles. They affirmed that individuals, not just states or governments, can be held accountable for war crimes. They rejected the following orders defense, and they demonstrated that even low-level functionaries, guards, doctors, administrators, are responsible for their actions. These principles were later codified in international law. They formed the basis for the Geneva Conventions, for the International Criminal Court, for the trials in Yugoslavia and Rwanda. The Dachau trials were imperfect, but they were necessary, and they changed the way the world thinks about accountability. Here is what I want you to understand about the Dachau Trials. They were messy. They were rushed. They were conducted in the immediate aftermath of a war that had killed over 50 million people. The judges were soldiers, not legal scholars. The defendants were guards, not masterminds. But the evidence was undeniable. The camp was still there. The crematoria were still there. The survivors were still there. And the question the tribunal faced was this: what do we do with the men who made this possible? We could have shot them on sight. Many American soldiers wanted to. When the 45th Infantry Division liberated Dachau on April 29, 1945, some guards were killed by U.S. troops in the immediate aftermath. That was vengeance. The Dachau Trials, imperfect as they were an attempt at justice. And the difference matters. 80 years after the Dachau executions, Johann Viktor Kirsch is almost forgotten. His name does not appear in history textbooks. He is not mentioned in Holocaust memorials. He is a footnote, a minor figure in a vast machinery of death. But his story matters, because he was not a mastermind. He was not a commandant. He was a guard, a functionary, an ordinary man who made extraordinary choices. He chose to beat prisoners. He chose to separate children from their parents. He chose to participate. And when he was held accountable, he offered no defense, no apology, no acknowledgement, just silence. And that silence, that refusal to confront what he had done, is the most damning evidence of all. I want to end this video with a question. If you were Johann Viktor Kirsch, if you were standing on that gallows with the noose around your neck, what would you have said? Would you have apologized? Would you have claimed you were just following orders? Would you have remained silent? Because the answer to that question tells you something about yourself. It tells you whether you believe in individual responsibility, whether you believe that even in the worst systems, individuals have choices. Kirsch had choices. He could have refused to beat prisoners. He could have refused to participate in the Kinderaktion. He could have deserted. Would he have been punished? Yes. Would it have been dangerous? Yes. But the people he beat, the children he separated from their parents, they had no choices. They had no escape. And that is the difference. Kirsch chose to participate. And when he was given the chance to speak, he chose silence. So I ask again, what would you have said? On May 28, 1946, Johann Viktor Kirsch was hanged at Landsberg Prison. He was 55 years old. He had served at Auschwitz and Dachau. He had beaten prisoners with an iron rod. He had separated children from their parents, knowing they would be murdered. He was convicted at the Dachau Trials. And in his final moments, he said nothing. No apology. No remorse. Just silence. 28 men were executed at Landsberg over 2 days in May 1946. All of them SS guards. All of them convicted. All of them forgotten except by historians. If you want to understand how the Nuremberg trials worked and why they were different from Dachau, check out my video on the execution of the major Nazi war criminals. Link on screen. Subscribe, because I explain history with accuracy and respect. And comment below, were the Dachau trials justice or revenge? Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.